This is London Calling.
If you're from the UK, and maybe even if you're not, there's a very good chance you grew up on a diet of BBC content. Dear old Auntie Beeb, Monty Python, Fawlty Towers, Songs of Praise, Robot Wars, and who could forget when Del Boy fell through the counter? The BBC is responsible for producing much of the media that holds the UK together, but the Beeb is far from the little old organisation it often presents itself as. Directly employing over 35,000 people, the BBC has a global audience of well over 300 million. Roughly 1 in 16 people on Earth watch, listen or read BBC reports. Inside the UK, it's generally regarded as the most trustworthy, authoritative news source. Because of its power and political and cultural significance, the BBC and its positions are commonly scrutinised. It is constantly attacked in the right-wing press as holding a leftist bias. This is particularly odd, as a great body of evidence, from books to reports to peer-reviewed articles from media studies scholars, actually strongly suggests the exact opposite, that the BBC represents the conservative voice of the British establishment. Now sit back as I take you through nearly 100 years of BBC history. The British Broadcasting Corporation, as it's now known, was established in 1922 to take advantage of the new radio technology. The key individual in its rise was Lord John Reith, whose mission to inform, educate and entertain is still its directive to this day. However, it was really during the general strike of 1926 where the organisation took off. 1920s Europe was an extremely turbulent time politically, as class war, revolution and socialism were at the forefront of everyone's minds. In 1917, Russia had gone through 2 revolutions that overthrew the Tsar and the aristocracy and brought Lenin's Bolshevik party into power over the world's largest country, only for it to be engulfed in a huge civil war that involved many countries in Europe attempting to strangle socialism in its cradle, as Winston Churchill put it. The German uprisings between 1917 and 1919 had ended World War I and led to the fall of the German monarchy and the birth of a parliamentary republic. Closer to home, Ireland had managed to rid itself of British rule by 1922, while Glasgow was engulfed in a continuing communist uprising called Red Clydeside. For many in the aristocratic elite, like Lord Reith, it appeared their world was ending, and so, when the General Council of the Trade Union Congress called a general strike in 1926 in support of British miners, the possibility of substantive social change appeared high. Lord Reith offered his company's services to the Conservative government to counter and suppress the strikes. The BBC became a vital instrument of propaganda for the government determined to break the strike, in the words of Tom Mills, a historian of the BBC. The BBC banned all broadcasts from the Labour Party and put out non-stop government propaganda demonising the strikers. The strike was quickly defeated and Reith proudly announced through the airwaves, "You have heard the message from the King and the Prime Minister. It remains only to add the conviction that the nation's happy escape has been in large measure due to personal trust in the Prime Minister." Lord Reith claimed that Britain had been saved, later reflecting on his role that if there had been a state broadcaster in France in the 18th century, there would have been no French Revolution. Thus, from virtually its very birth, the BBC has been a strongly conservative instrument designed to propagandise the public and has been closely aligned with the interests of the British state. Rather unusually, the BBC is not funded by advertising, but from a licence fee paid for by all Britons, with some exceptions, who wish to have a television. The cost of the licence, and therefore the budget of the BBC, is set by the government, giving it a weapon to use against the corporation. As former director of BBC personnel Michael Bett said, the licence fee became a bigger and bigger political issue. Therefore it mattered very much what the government thought about you, and you couldn't rely on your general reputation. You had to please the government. Debates about whether the government should simply officially commandeer the BBC were had throughout its history. Winston Churchill, for instance, argued for a government takeover. But it was decided to keep the BBC on a leash through the licence fee, controlling it while maintaining the facade of independence. As Lord Reith, the father of the Beeb, said, the government know that they can trust us not to be really impartial. The first real empirical academic studies of the BBC, its content and its biases began to emerge in the 1970s from the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham and the Glasgow University Media Group. For example, in More Bad News, the Glasgow Media Group analysed the BBC's coverage of the UK's economic troubles in the 1970s. It found the media emphasised the government's explanation that unions and industrial action were to blame for Britain's low productivity and ignored the unions' competing argument about low levels of investment in manufacturing. Thus, the explanation that strikes were to blame for the economy set the tone for the news and the range of the debate as the BBC pointed the finger at the unions. Nevertheless, Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was determined to bring the BBC to heel and make it her personal lapdog. She forced BBC Director General Alistair Milne to resign and appointed her own hand-picked director, John Birt. This led to sackings of ideologically impure staff. Birt was a free market fundamentalist and decided to break up the BBC to run on market lines. Each department was turned into an independent business in a marketplace, meaning TV shows would have to buy or rent clothes from the wardrobe department, buy food for its staff at the canteen department, etc. And all these areas had to make money or they'd perish. Under this system, administration costs ballooned. Throughout the entire period, the Secret Services had a veto over BBC recruitment. Any applicant for an influential job would be vetted by MI5 on the express purposes of preventing people with left-wing views reaching positions of power. It is unknown whether this policy is still active. The media group also studied the BBC coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict and found it to be overwhelmingly pro-Israeli, with Palestinian viewpoints either dismissed or completely absent, framing Israel as under attack from an aggressive Palestinian force. The BBC was also key in pushing the UK into the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The government's justification was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and could hit the UK within 45 minutes. It was based upon a clearly fraudulent dossier that included material lifted from a high school essay. The BBC aired a report euphemistically claiming the dossier might have been sexed up to make it more alarming. Now that's a bit like saying O.J. Simpson has a colourful past with the law. Nevertheless, this mild criticism was enough dissent for the government to force the Director General, Greg Dyke, to resign. He was replaced by a Tory peer who apologised unreservedly to the government for publishing the criticism. In their study of the BBC coverage of the austerity measures the Conservative-led government was forcing through, Gilly Boyce-Kay and Lee Salter found the BBC continually presented the economic collapse as a debt crisis, not as a crisis of capitalism, as it is now largely accepted to be across the spectrum. The BBC took for granted the idea that cuts to public services were necessary and the only way to alleviate the problem, thus legitimising a highly unpopular right-wing policy that entrenched and increased economic inequality, and is now known to have led to the deaths of 120,000 people, according to the British Medical Journal. This was due to the closing of hospitals, an increase in the suicide rate, and the removal of other vital services. For example, one feature on the BBC website was an interactive "What Would You Cut" game that invited readers to choose which areas to cut from, for example, to housing, health, education, or welfare. It was taken for granted that the cuts were necessary and inevitable, rather than a deliberate effort to reduce the standard of living of the population to decrease their power vis-à-vis the rich. Furthermore, the only tax increases allowed in the feature were to value-added tax and not to income tax, inheritance tax, super tax, land tax, or any other measure that would primarily penalise the rich. Only value-added tax, which primarily affects the poor, was an option. Thus, there was no alternative to neoliberalism. The authors conclude that, contrary to the dominant idea that the BBC is biased to the left, our findings suggest that its economic journalism discursively normalises neoliberal economics, not necessarily as desirable, but certainly as inevitable. Mike Berry's 2016 study of how the BBC covered the economy found that politicians and other establishment figures from think tanks and the City of London dominated the debate, and alternative voices from labour unions, representatives of civil society, and even economists who predicted the Great Crash were shut out of the conversation or were completely ignored. The BBC took for granted that there was a debt crisis, despite the fact that UK debt to GDP looks like this on a graph. And this chart showing what solutions to the manufactured problem were offered tells its own story. A cut in public services was overwhelmingly the answer, according to the BBC, with some discussion of increasing taxes that primarily affect poor people, like taxes on food, alcohol, fuel, and cigarettes. Taxing the rich, corporations, or saving money by ditching nuclear weapons, all left-wing solutions to a problem the left did not accept was one, were virtually absent. Karen Weil-Jorgensen et al.'s study on the BBC and sourcing, also published in Journalism, found what they described as the systematic overrepresentation of elitist views on the network with a strong conservative bias to the news. When there was a Labour government in 2007 in power, the Prime Minister appeared in 3.9% of the stories in the sample, compared to the Conservative opposition's 2.3%. By 2012, when there was a Conservative government, the Prime Minister appeared in 5.3% of the stories, compared to just 1.5% of the Labour opposition. They also found that the BBC is getting more right-wing over time too, with Conservative sources rising from 41 to 48% of articles, while Labour sources have dropped from 45% to just 26.3% by 2012. They conclude that these views are consistent with previous research on the BBC's agenda and were echoed in informal responses to our research from other journalists who argued that a bias towards conservative sources may be explained by the defensiveness of the BBC caused by constant accusations of a left-wing bias. As one anonymous BBC journalist put it, 4 out of the 5 BBC editors I worked for were acutely conscious of the perception that the BBC is left-wing and programmed to counter it. And that's the point. The BBC is not and has never been left-wing, but the accusation is used as a disciplining tactic to get the broadcaster to be even more right-wing. Think of it like this. If you're a right-winger and you know a broadcaster has a bias towards you and you want to keep it that way, what's the most effective way of doing that? Acknowledging that it's biased towards you and arguing it should stay that way? Or accusing it of being biased against you and demanding it listen to you more? The BBC also displayed a clear and undoubtable bias during the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. Professor John W. Robertson's study on the BBC found a 3-to-2 ratio in favour of anti to pro-independence voices.
Lots of people think the SNP leader Alex Salmond has a pretty big head, even if the 5-2 diet means the body's getting a bit smaller.
Fear not. While Alex Salmond didn't quite promise a land flowing with milk and honey, he did claim it would be a beacon of what he called progressiveness. You say that an independent Scotland would be a beacon of progressiveness. Mm. I think I recall Robert Mugabe saying something similar about Zimbabwe.
I don't think, Jeremy, you can do yourself any great favours by comparing Scotland to Zimbabwe.
No, I'm comparing you to Mugabe.
However, the framing of the debate was more important. The BBC would usually start with an anti-independence statement from a source it presented as an expert or neutral, leading to a defensive remark from a pro-independence voice, only to leave the last word to another anti-independence source. Thus, stories about independence were framed as bad news for Scotland. This came overwhelmingly to be known as Project Fear inside the country. Furthermore, the independence campaign was presented as the personal endeavour of First Minister Alex Salmond, a man the media spent months demonising as arrogant or even a dictator. The BBC's flagship news programmes displayed open contempt or even hatred towards Salmond. Therefore, the BBC was crucial again in manufacturing consent for the establishment's view of the world. But the most prominent left-wing politician to come around in decades is Jeremy Corbyn, and if the BBC had anything of a left-wing bias, we should expect to see effusive praise for the new Labour leader. In fact, Corbyn has been hounded by the media since day one, described as a terrorist, a KGB agent, an anti-Semite, a laughingstock, and even a member of the IRA. One academic study of the media coverage of Corbyn had a section entitled Delegitimisation through Ridicule, Scorn and Personal Attacks, and the BBC has been no exception to this. Its own study found its political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, who claims she would die in a ditch for impartiality, guilty of carrying out a biased, partial and systemic attack against him. Kuenssberg describes herself as an outsider, despite being the granddaughter of the last Governor-General of Nigeria, the sister to the High Commissioner of Mozambique, and a descendant of the von Kuenssberg German aristocratic dynasty. And this background is hardly uncommon for key BBC editors. Nick Robinson, political editor for the BBC for 10 years and now host of the Today programme, was chairman of the National Young Conservatives and president of Oxford University's Conservative Association. Evan Davis, the presenter of the flagship politics programme Newsnight between 2014 and 2018, was an economist at the ultra-conservative Institute for Fiscal Studies and argued that we should privatise the National Health Service. Andrew Neil, presenter of the flagship BBC politics programmes This Week on BBC One and The Daily Politics on BBC Two, was far-right media baron Rupert Murdoch's right-hand man. Murdoch was the owner of Fox News, and Neil was the editor of Murdoch's Sunday Times before becoming chairman of Sky TV, and is currently the chairman of Press Holdings Group, which includes the strongly conservative Spectator magazine. These four are great examples of how a conservative ideology is maintained at the BBC without the need for overt censorship. Instead, candidates are pre-selected from the ranks of the upper middle class who have gone to the private schools and elite universities where they imbibe the correct worldview. The majority of people in the UK are sceptical of the media, and only those socialised into believing the mainstream press would apply. Furthermore, to get ahead, it is now virtually mandatory to work for free on an internship in London for 6 months or more to land a job in the media, which further discourages a diverse set of candidates. 33% of BBC managers attended either Oxford or Cambridge University, compared with just 0.8% of the population, while at least 62% attended one of the elite Russell Group universities, compared with just 11% of the public. This elitist social background is an important tool in establishing and continuing the conservative outlook of the organisation and the media in general. There's a lot more studies I could cite and go on for another 20 minutes, but I'll start to wrap up here. The take-home message is that the BBC was almost from day one set up as the mouthpiece of the establishment to protect said establishment and attack leftist political movements. It has consistently taken right-wing positions on key political issues according to a great number of academic studies. The government has consistently controlled the news outlet too, and its key political staff are conservative, and the BBC ignores or even attacks leftist voices and figures. As former Director General of the BBC, Greg Dyke, said, the organisation helps maintain an unequal political system by being part of a Westminster conspiracy. They don't want anything to change. It's not in their interests. As another ex-Director General said, the BBC is a creation of the establishment and it depends on the approval of the establishment for its continuance in being. Apologies for the late video. I've been having some real problems with copyright on this channel, but that should be all behind me now. So if you're not subscribed, why not do that just now? Links to handy sources mentioned and to this channel's Patreon and Twitter are in the description too.